Welcome to the In Process podcast. I'm your host, Matt Thomas, and I'm sitting here with Emilio Rockwell, who's going to be reading two poems, I Remember and The Appalachian Poet.
I'm Emilio Rockwell. I'm from Costa Rica, and I'm an MTSU student for pre-med studying fermentation science. I'm a young poet and an aspiring writer. I remember how she smiled that day, the sun in her gold-green eyes, how the light danced across her skin as she spoke without disguise. I remember how she told me she'd not settle down, she warned me don't attach, how like a moth to flame she drew me in, I couldn't just detach. I remember how she held the child so lovingly, though 'twas at their first meet, how the child twixt her arms knew instantly that girl to her core was sweet. I remember her soft lips that day when we first shared that kiss, how I long most every day for one more from my miss. I remember the way she asked me to move those books that day so meekly, how she showed me I'd mistaken that for a question, and not so very sweetly. I remember whilst we slept, my arm round her was hastening, how my hand oft found her breast for faithful nightly stationing. I remember every loved one's quest to find our lover's title, how we swore we were but friends to them in answer to their cital. I remember her teary eyes that night she said we need to talk, how our child was coming soon as I could at her but gawk. I remember the loving words she spoke to me so very awfully often, how through my wounded angered haze my heart she yet could soften. I remember the sweat twinkling there all across her skin, how she labored now in love for that teeny tiny hymn. I remember terror then as they rolled her down the hall, how even holding him couldn't soften my heart's fall. I remember the hope rising in me fast as to her side aloud, how weak and shaking arms she clung to me, her inner strength unbowed. I remember all the times she learned the better way for me, how I often failed her though, in her shadow plain to see. I remember how I loved her once, from first love's fateful gaze, how she left this poor fool in a mumbling, bumbling daze. But what does she remember now, these last years of memory? Have I left her with loving thoughts, as she did with reverie? Have her tireless hands been held with the love they so richly do deserve? Have they felt a measure now of the warmth with which they served? Has her precious heart been party to the best of my protection? Or did I fail to give her then, in form like her affection? What memories have I given her, when she's given all her life? Has she felt a measure of her ceaseless love, this angel called my wife?
This might be a bit of personal projection, but when I write a poem, usually one line pops into my head alongside a concept and I build from there. So for this, was there a genesis? Was there one specific line for you that kicked it off?
Yes, actually there was, which isn't the case with most poems for me. I remember whilst we slept, my arm round her was hastening. I was lying in bed next to her and found myself doing this thing that I've done for years now. Every time we go to bed, it's the same way. I felt like I wanted to capture snippets of those kind of typical moments for us, things that we do, inside jokes, moments that make us laugh or cry together, things that were kind of defining moments of our life and that really embody what it is that makes our relationship ours. And that was kind of where I actually wrote this in bed on my cell phone, rolled over and wrote it up because I just wanted to get everything on paper.
It's clearly the story of your relationship with your wife, but not entirely linear. It's presented through these little moments one by one, but you have in the third line, or third stanza, I remember how she held the child so lovingly, though 'twas at their first meet. But then in the fourth stanza you jump to, I remember her soft lips that day when we first shared that kiss. So it's presented as if you're just thinking over the various moments in your relationship, but not entirely linear. How did you decide on that structure?
I did actually go with a linear one. The first child that I make mention of is my daughter.
Mm-hmm.
I raised my daughter by myself. And when she met my wife, it was really neat. They actually connected immediately. I've got pictures of those two. My wife holding my daughter by this strangler fig. It's called a iguerong, where I come from. We climb up the inside of the tree. Mm-hmm. Just really neat moments. There are moments where I can look back and remember not just words, but an image, a feeling, the wind through the trees and everything. And I wanted to kind of capture that moment. So yeah, the first time that she met my daughter, that was before we ever kissed. And then later on, the child that she is giving birth to is our son.
That adds a great new context to it. Let's jump to the childbirth aspect that you were talking about when she was giving birth to your son. It surprised me that you talked about the terror and how it couldn't soften your heart's fall even when you picked up the kid, because normally in most media that's presented as a very joyous moment, and I've never really heard it mentioned as something that terrified a person. Where did that come from?
My wife and I were planning to go with a natural delivery, but had to go with an emergency C-section. And we'd agreed ahead of time that one of us was going to stay with our child no matter what. So as they wheeled her off to go and work on her afterwards, I went with him, but I wanted to know how she was. I wanted to know she was okay, because C-sections are not at all gentle. They're pretty brutal, frankly. As advanced as we've gotten in other areas, they still look like a pretty barbaric practice, just with neat new instruments. And so seeing my wife shivering and shaking on the floor and unable to speak, or on the table, not the floor, and then they wheeling her down the hall and not knowing what was going to happen and hoping she was okay, I was terrified. And it wasn't until afterwards when I got to walk into the room that getting to hold her was kind of like that sweet relief you feel rushing down over you.
That's really something you see in the stanza where you say, I remember the hope rising in me, fast as to her side aloud, how weak and shaking arms she clung to me, her inner strength unbowed. Especially with the context, that gives a real rise and fall to the different emotions that you're presenting, the initial joy, and then rising into the terror. I feel like it captures the emotional reality of a relationship, of the way dynamics change. The one last thing I wanted to ask about before we move over to the Appalachian poet is, at the end, around the 15th stanza, you suddenly abandon the structure of I remember in the first line of the couplet and how weak in the second line, and start with, but what does she remember now, these last years of memory? Could you just talk about that decision and how you knew when you wanted to break structure like that?
The moment that I wanted to break with that structure was when I wanted to turn the lens. The way I see this whole poem is almost like the Muppets Christmas Carol, where there's a scene where somebody walks up to the window and they see time almost fast forwarded. They see a child come running in when they're growing up a little bit later, and they keep on coming back for little flashes as they go through time. That's how I kind of saw this poem. And so from going through this lens, seeing memories that I had gone through to the point where I felt like the most typical, the most typical experiences of our relationship that we'd already seen through that lens. I wanted to turn then to her today, away from that window that we're looking through, to her now. Mm-hmm. And then see, well, what about her? What does she have? What is she seeing? And what does she experience? Rather than looking through that window. And I think that breaking with that was similar to the way that I decided that I wanted to go ahead and include things like the terror in the whole poem, because I think that we so often hide fear, or we try to hide anything that feels vulnerable, or we're taught to, or we do just out of habit. We don't want to feel weak. So I wanted to go ahead and include those things that felt less refined, that mm-hmm. felt less accepted. I don't think that it's weak to do so. I wanted to kind of break away from the structured system and go to a raw, here's how she is today, here is what she deals with, or even just thinking about what it is that she deals with on a day-to-day basis. The Appalachian Poet. Where oft a doctor might wax eloquent in celebrations of his own acumen, The Appalachian poet shares in quiet words glimpses of real life as seen through the eyes of a human. With a reverence for the forerunners, the hills, the very nature flowing through his veins, he wields uncommon magic in the most human of ways that one could almost miss the mystic grains. But the magic is there in the slowing of time, that we might witness a moment in all its humanity. The spells he weaves are of deliberate simplicity, that any passerby might partake in this ancient magic most candidly. With a simplicity that might turn a Quaker green with ever-righteous envy, he smooths out tangled moments for the mind, his touch like nepenthe. He does not write of galaxies far away, nor taunt us with his skill in pedagogy. He shares such supremely human moments that they grow to the extraordinary. A young boy running barefoot in the hills of eastern Tennessee with windswept hair, relishing in the pleasures no urban sprawl could match, no matter how fair. 1 week setting foot in the scruffy city for a taste of the urban wild, the next few lost to the world of technology, but safe in the poet's magic styled. The poet does not speak as to an audience, nor in lecturing tones. He speaks as to a friend, describing one more of life's touchstones. A fountain pen, a blank booklet, and a moment in time might seem mundane, yet simple rituals turn these from ordinary to something more arcane. Write wherever you are, whispers the poet, with such quiet passion one might almost miss it. Write with whatever you have, he shares again, adding a typewriter to his toolkit. The secret of his magic is as simple as it is sound. The spell he now intones. Poetry rewards you for slowing down.
I love that one specifically because, given the context of the other one that you read, it really details your philosophy on writing, which is keep it simple, keep it grounded, keep it real. When did you decide that that's the style that you wanted? Was that something you always felt, or was there a moment that you knew that's how you wanted to write? Really? Tell me about that.
This poem is about Jesse Graves. He's a poet from ETSU. And when I was hearing him speak, it didn't sound like poetry that I'd heard before. It sounded like somebody, like a friend, telling you about something that they saw, a dream, a memory, a moment. It didn't sound like he was trying to kind of fit this into iambic pentameter or whatever. It wasn't following a specific set of rules. So I was trying to figure out what made that poetry. And I think to me, it's the almost storytelling quality of something that is the everyday experience and turning it into something magical.
Tell me about that last line. You wrote, "The spell he now intones, poetry rewards you for slowing down." When did you make that realization?
I can't take credit for that. Jesse Graves actually told us, like after he'd read some of his poems, he told us that one of his friends and mentors, I believe his name was Arthur, told him one day that poetry rewards us for slowing down. And it felt like one of those things, like that nugget of wisdom that some sage in the mountains would go ahead and share with us. And so I felt like it had to be the closing line, because I felt like that really did sum up everything that he was saying. We all have these experiences in life. Like you live, I live, everybody goes through their lives. And it's when we slow down to notice what's going on around us that poetry rewards us for that. I grew up in a cloud forest in Central America. So running around in the forest was kind of what I did, to the point that my family had to go and find me several miles out into the woods by myself when I was in diapers. I didn't think of myself as a poet when I was younger. That was something people smarter and more gifted did. And it was when I started looking at the poetry that really spoke to me, which generally was something more accessible. So I guess I wanted to take those things that made me fall in love with poetry and then look back at those moments that were magical. The ones that you miss, I don't know how your upbringing was, but for me it was those moments of carefree connection with nature, those moments where there wasn't anything to fear or to worry about. Maybe I should have. I mean, picking up an eyelash viper as a 3-year-old is probably not the best thing, but It was that kind of wide-eyed wonder with which we view the world that I kind of look back and try to capture moments of that.
I love the line you have in here. With a reverence for the forerunners, the hills, the very nature flowing through his veins, he wields uncommon magic in the most human of ways that one could almost miss the mystic grains. Could you tell me about that last thing, mystic grains there?
I guess I feel like the Appalachian poet, the way I see him in my head, is kind of almost like a modern day druid. It's an everyday magic. It's a connection to nature that is the magic itself. And I think that we miss the magic in our everyday interactions. When you feel that energy right before a kiss, to me, that's magic. When you both are thinking the same thing, whether it be your friend, your partner, whoever, I think those moments are magic. I think that the simplest of moments that actually reach down to our core, those are magic. And the modern day druid, the Appalachian poet, taps into that everyday magic and brings it to the forefront. If we just pay attention, we can be drawn into something much more magical than our everyday life simply by slowing down.
I think that's something that everybody has an enormous amount of nostalgia for, something that you can't really place, but being a kid and that sort of magical feeling of being out in nature and feeling absolutely at home.
Yeah, I think we all have that moment that we look back with fondness and we treasure that. Sometimes we don't think about it, but when we do, I think it really touches us still.
Is there one or two moments you could point out in your childhood that this reminds you of?
On Saturday afternoons, my dad used to go out after we'd all finished the family meal, and he would leave little pistas or clues that we had to use to track him down. And I know that it was kind of a game, but for me it was more having to slow down and pay attention to what was around me. Yeah, to go ahead and see where my dad had gone, but also to really appreciate what we had around us and that we all did it. My grandmother, my aunts, my uncles, all of us, we'd go out. And you went out, and at the end, when you were coming back, you could see the sun setting out over the Gulf. And it was just, I think there's something magical about virtually every moment that I had growing up there.